Welcome back. I've been gone a long time, and I know that some of you have been asking me where I am. Some of you even asked if I'm all right, if I'm still alive, I guess. Well, it's summertime in the Lakes region of New Hampshire, and during these months we get our short summer, which comes and goes away way too quickly. We have a very short summer up here, so I like to really take time to enjoy it and you know, do a bit of outdoor work, get out and do some fishing, some shooting naturally, and I've got a lot of yard work. I like to work around my yard, and I got some tomatoes growing and things like that. So that's where I've been. So thank you for those of you who've been concerned and inquiring about my absence. I appreciate it, and I want to talk today about the new rifle, actually, that I just got, the AR-15 A4. This is a fabulous rifle. Well, in many ways, to me at least, this is kind of a flashback, you might say, to me for the weapon that I carried in Vietnam in way back, a long time ago. That was the A1 version, which was a slightly improved version over the original M16. By that time we had gotten rid of the three-prong flash hider in favor of the birdcage flash hider, not the one with the reduced signature, you know, solid bottom, but you know, it didn't have this heavier. This is a substantially heavier gun, much heavier barrel in the forend. This is not an H-bar. It's not a heavy barreled AR-15. It has a tapered section in the body of the barrel, but it's definitely stiffer and heavier than the one that I would have been carrying around. Rather than the integrated carry handle and sight, it has a removable flat top style added on handle, quickly removable easily, with the Picatinny flat top. Everybody knows about them with the M4. It's got the typical standard elevation adjustment, which in my day was not present. We did all our elevation adjustments with just the front sight post. The front sight post in those days, by the way, was a round and subject to glare type of front post. The Marines were the ones who suggested in testing that the M16 be outfitted instead with a square post, which was less prone to reflection. There's other changes. The buttstock is notably longer, more substantial. It's a different material than the glossy. It was kind of a freaky looking, you know, glossy black in those days. It was slippery to hold and things like this. This is kind of a fuzzy texture. It's very easy to hang on to. Some people don't like the fact that it gets stained with oil and solvents and things like that, but it cleans right up. It's not a porous plastic, so it cleans right up with whatever you want, get it stained with. The forend handguard is significantly different. It's rounder. It's round and it is easy to hold. It doesn't have the triangular shape, which that did have the advantage of having a very flat bottom, like a beaver tail forend on a target rifle. So it was easy to mount it on a sandbag and shoot. But in so many ways, the gun has improved. And it's just a bigger, more substantial gun that's easier to mount for me, for a larger person, and it's got the delta ring now instead of the old straight stock ring. So in all ways, things have improved. The trigger's just as bad. It's never that trigger hasn't changed one whit. It's still crummy, creepy 7.5 to 8 pound military trigger pull. Although this is a single stage rather than a two-stage trigger. I'll fix that. I've used Geissele triggers in the past. I love two-stage Geissele triggers. You get the first stage, which is maybe 2.5 pounds, and then the final stage is 1.25 pounds, pound and a quarter. So it's an extremely crisp trigger. I love them. So that'll be the next addition to that rifle. But I haven't talked about the AR-15 and the M16 and the 223 and the 5.56 NATO up until this point, largely because, frankly, there's a lot to talk about, and I really should break it down into several different video episodes so that I don't drag this out. Let me, in today's talk, I'm just going to focus on the early development stages of the AR-15, how it came to be our service weapon that we renamed the M16. You have to go back to World War II. It was several issues were certainly evident following World War II, and when they did a review of all the things that had occurred, and they became even more evident after Korea, which was fought between 1950 and 1953. Substantial problems arose with regard to supply of ammo on the ground. As you probably know, the M1 Garand was a horrendously heavy rifle. It once loaded, it was very, and with a sling on it, it was over 10 pounds. It had a rather, in terms of battle necessity, it had a magazine, an end block clip that held 8 rounds, which was found in many situations to simply not be sufficient for battle engagements. The Battle of the Bulge became a very big problem. For instance, that was one of those battles where available ammo really shrank to the point where the individual soldier had very little, sometimes no ammo left. Even if he had a larger capacity magazine, as was developed after Korea, with the M14, even with the larger capacity magazine, he was still limited by the bulk factor, how much he could physically carry on his person. The M14's, basically redesign of the M1 Garand offered, increased magazine capacity. So you had an insertable magazine that could increase the capacity of the soldiers' firepower in the gun, but he still couldn't carry anymore physically, really. I mean, and whatever, they shaved 2 inches of barrel length off of the 24-inch barreled Garand and made it a 22-inch barreled M14, but with its heavy walnut stock, it didn't really change the weight of the rifle more than about a half a pound. And then when you added the box magazine to it that was fully loaded, the weight actually went up. So that's why the M14 had a very, very short life. It probably, it's no question, it's classed as one of the biggest military failures of procurement of all time when it came to general issue. Now the M14 is still certainly around, and I don't want to bog down into the history of the M14, but it's still around. It's still used for dress ceremonies. It's still used for target shooting. It's still used for sniper shooting in some situations and things like that. But largely, it fell out of favor almost as quickly as it came into use. And it came into use basically in an embattled situation where the military was screaming for a new gun to replace the Garand, which was basically, the Garand began development in the 20s and came into use during World War II. But the M14 was something which the military brass was screaming for. They fought hard to get it, and it seemed like Congress had no sooner acquiesced and doled out the money than the generals were saying, well, you know, now we're kind of not sure. There was a lot of real bad blood going on in Washington over these things, because we had just come out of two wars in the middle of the 50s. People like General William Wyman thought, well, you know, the whole idea of small, easily carried, heavily stacked magazines, such as the Kalashnikov that the Soviets were using. This was the Cold. We were right in the middle of the Cold War era here. This is the Cold War was a frightening thing. I can remember, you know, learning to identify siren calls out in the, you know, outside. We had test drills in schools, getting under our desks and all that. We were expecting basically to be obliterated any minute with, you know, a nuclear bomb. But during that time, General William Wyman was one of the people who was a proponent of the idea of a lighter rifle rather than the big, heavy battle rifle, which was the signature of the ground troop. He wanted to do what the Soviets were doing, and which other countries had already begun to do, which was, and the British were considering a .280 caliber, a 7mm caliber round, and I say .280 because they use the inch designation customarily rather than the metric designation too. So they wanted to go to a .280. We didn't see much advantage in going to a .280. 25 was on the minds of some people, but you know, Wyman was somebody who thought that you know, going to smaller bore could certainly be the answer. The company that really addressed this situation early on was Armalite. Now, Armalite was a subsidiary of Fairchild Engine and Aircraft Corporation. Now, you say, well, what does an aircraft company got to do with making guns? Well, very simply, you know, during World War II, everybody became very familiar with the fact that people who were not in the business of making military goods, military armament and everything else, were suddenly making those products, making those things for the U.S. government. For instance, you had most of your military weapons were certainly made by traditional arms manufacturers such as Remington and Winchester and such as that. But you had in addition, you had an awful lot of companies that were making weaponry that had no previous experience with it. So it was not unusual for you know, for the military to be looking outside of the arms industry and even outside of their own sphere. What was their own sphere? Well, it was actually kind of, I guess you could say, it was probably like the country club of the military. That was the Springfield Armory, or in the larger scope, it was the Ordnance, the U.S. Ordnance Department. U.S. Ordnance, when you think that was a really classy thing to be named the colonel of in charge of U.S. Ordnance at Springfield Armory at Springfield, Massachusetts, and I'm certainly not talking about the Springfield Armory Company, which is run in Genesee, Illinois. That's a private firm that has it's common in name only, and the product that they make, which is similar to the military M14. But this Armalite company had come up with a product which was interesting to some people in the military, but not very interesting to some of the military brass and some of the custodians of the Ordnance Department. U.S. Ordnance Department, you know, they were, as I say, they were a select group of people who, you know, if you look back in the past, some of them were, you know, highly known. They were, you know, like Colonel Townsend Whalen was a very, very well-known individual. You know, it gave you immediate access to knowledge about firearms that the average person simply doesn't have, its manufacturing and everything else. So he was a highly published individual. So to be amongst that type of, you know, bloodline was a big deal. And it's no small deal, you know, when you have a stamp placed into the buttstock of a rifle with your initials on it, and that is forevermore. You know, that's kind of a big deal, you know, to have your initials stamped in all the M1 Garands that went out for a significant number of years, and such as that. So they didn't want to have the cradle rocked. It's a very nice thing they had going on. They really did not want to have the cradle rocked by having some you know, company from outside of this very unique and limited and the clique that existed in the Ordnance Department. So here we have Armalite Company now, headed by Eugene Stoner. I mean, this guy was a brainchild. He was the same type of cloth that John Browning and Arthur Savage, you know, John Garand, all these different people from antiquity, and Samuel Colt, that they all had one thing in common. They knew how to think outside the box. They knew how to basically come up with something out of whole cloth. They could generate out of their own minds designs and things that nobody ever had conceived before. They could work with brand new, they could go to a drawing board and come up with something brand new. And this was the sort of thing that Eugene Stoner was capable of doing. Now, perhaps his most, I would say his earliest venture into getting into military arms was his introduction of the AR-15 22 Hornet into the Air Force survival rifle program. General Curtis LeMay, who was a very, very well-known and very powerful general of the era, he had been involved with big campaigns in World War II. He was the principal behind the airlift, the Berlin airlift, and he had a lot of swagger. He was also he was the principal behind the leader behind SAC, S-A-C, the Strategic Air Command, which was dissolved back in the early 90s. But the Strategic Air Command, SAC, was something which, you know, basically was there to protect everybody at home. That was our homeland defense against nuclear attack. We called it the triad defense. So he was a very powerful individual, very influential in Washington, and when he said that he wanted to have a survival rifle which was made by Armalite, he simply got it. Now that AR-5 was a bolt-action 22 Hornet rifle, which was very, very futuristic, and it was a self-contained type of a collapsible gun that could be carried in, you know, in a very, very light, could be carried in fighter aircraft and U.S. Military aircraft for survival purposes. But probably the first Armalite that was actually seen by human eyes, you know, on a large scale, was in Hollywood's From Russia with Love, with Sean Connery and playing James Bond. And there was a famous scene where he's basically running across a grassy hilltop, exposed, fully exposed. He's got his fedora on, and he's carrying a briefcase, and he's running as a helicopter is chasing him across this field and trying to kill him. And you get two Soviets that are in the helicopter, and they're shooting down at him, and they're trying to run him over with the helicopter and everything else. And he scoots underneath some stones, and he whips out this very futuristic AR-7. The AR-7 is still around. Henry's making it now. It's Henry rifle is making it now, and it's a big plastic buttstock. And if you peel the cap off the butt, inside you find the barreled action and a magazine. And he scooted underneath these rocks for protection. He quickly assembled it, and he shot one of the people in the aircraft who was he had just pulled the pin on a grenade. The helicopter blows up and falls to the ground in a big fury, and then he kisses the girl, and everything is the way James Bond. So that's the sort of thing that Americans wanted in those days. They loved futuristic stuff. I mean, it was the Jetsons. It was all you needed to do was start looking towards futuristic ideas, and Americans really loved it. It was no more interesting to look at a M16 or a Garand than it was to look at an old Edsel or something like that. They really didn't care less about the old stuff anymore. They wanted new. Well, that wasn't the way of thinking for the U.S. Ordnance Department. As I say, the U.S. Ordnance Department was a very, very cliquey group. They were protecting their interests. They were protecting their own positions and their prestige, and they knew the writing was on the wall if somebody came in the door with a gun which they could not produce. They didn't have, Springfield Armory was simply not set up to produce a gun such as the AR-15. It was contrary to their whole manufacturing technology that they had, which was rather antiquated. It was based on rifles that were made way back before the 1900s. So they didn't have that technology. And Armalite also had a patent on their design. So they were in a boxed canyon. And they fought tooth and glove against Stoner's design when he first started to introduce it. The first introduction of the AR-15 fell basically flat on its face because, first of all, it faced this headwind. You had these people who were basically opposed to the whole notion of bringing in a new rifle that they didn't design. And they certainly didn't like the idea of reducing the caliber down from the traditional 30 caliber bore. These people were not pragmatists. These people were thinking in terms. Their pragmatism stopped at the title that they had on their door and on their deck. They didn't want to upset the apple cart. Stoner actually produced, he actually submitted a rifle for testing and everything in the late 50s, around 1957, and it suffered disastrously because not only did it have this opposition, but he was at the time using a steel-lined aluminum barrel, very, very lightweight gun. It was way too futuristic. They had a problem where the barrel actually burst. It was not known for reliability. It hadn't really been perfected yet. It was ahead of its time, so it was shelved. The whole project was rather shelved by the Ordnance Department, but work on it continued behind the scenes. And people like General Curtis LeMay, who were already vested in the idea of modernizing weaponry. Curtis LeMay, he had a whole bunch of aging M1 carbines that were issued to the Air Force. That was all they had, and he saw great merit in having an AR style gun. Well, The first ARs that were tested were actually there were four of them. There was the AR-10, which was a 7.62 NATO cartridge, and that was to basically compete against the FN-FAL gun, which had been adopted by much of Europe. It was made by Fabrique Nationale, and that was a gun, by the way, that was invented by a protege of John Browning too. That I can't remember his name right now. A very long French name, but the first ones were the AR-10, the AR-15, and the AR-16 and the AR-18. You probably never heard of. You've heard of the AR-10. That's the 30 caliber that's still around. But what you've probably not heard of was the AR-16, which was the 7.62 NATO with a wooden stock, and it was a folding stock version. You're thinking, gee, where do they put the buffer spring? Well, it was different. That and the AR-16, the 18 had slide rails upon which the bolt carrier slid, and each of those slide rails was coupled with a spring. So, and it was also, rather than being a milled aluminum receiver, it was more on the idea of some of the European designs where they stamped steel receiver, and a lot of parts that were machined on Swiss machine screw devices and things like machinery. So it was a different sort of gun, but it was one of the four guns that Stoner had developed, and it was actually tested by the military. They really immediately rejected the AR-10. They found it to be a terrific rifle, but they still wanted to get away from that heavy ammo. They wanted to reduce the weight of the ammo and increase the carrying capacity for the individual soldier on the ground in the Marine. But Curtis LeMay, being the guy he was, the powerful guy he was, he basically just ordered up a bunch to send to Vietnam for testing. And you know, the Air Force had its own special forces, and they were used in combat in the early 60s with some of the advisory troops that were over there. This was before Vietnam really broke out, but there was sort of a testing ground there, a live testing ground with Vietnam on the scene. The French had moved out of Vietnam, and we were there now, and we were in an advisory capacity. So about 1963, some of the reports of what that 223 rifle was doing at the time, and it hadn't yet been called the 5.56, it was still an American cartridge, a Remington cartridge. But reports came back that it had devastating effect on the enemy. It was being used with a 20-inch rifle, very, very similar to this. It was the first version of the AR-15. I don't think it had even been called the M16 yet because it hadn't been given an official military designation. But its effects were reported to be very, very good in the field. Marksmanship was a big issue. In military testing, it was reported that marksmanship increased to the point where over half of the trainees scored as expert on the range, which was in great difference to the 30 caliber rifle experience, where only a quarter of them could barely make expert. And so there were a lot of factors that were leading into this. There was a parallel universe, so you might say, that was going on. So you had General Curtis LeMay with his interest in the AR-15. In the meantime, what led up to that was the development of the cartridge itself. General William Wyman had previously stated that the military's demand for a rifle was that it had to have a projectile that would penetrate both sides of a military steel pot. For those of you who are not aware, but in my day, it was the same thing as in Korea and World War II. You had a steel pot that went over a fiber liner that you wore on your head. Sometimes in dress uniform you wore a fiber liner and then you put a steel pot on it. Well, it had to be able to penetrate a steel pot both sides at 500 yards. Now I think that probably sounds like somebody was rigging the deck so that a .22 caliber bullet would purportedly fail. Well, it didn't fail actually. The round was able to, a 55 grain bullet was able to penetrate both sides of the steel pot at 500 yards. So that laid aside that test requirement, which might have seemed a little bit severe for such a small bore diameter. To anybody who was around at the time, the .222 Remington had already been a great success in the commercial market. The .222 Remington had been developed in 1950 by Mike Walker of Remington, and he was also a thinker that could think outside the box. Well, everything in firearms comes from something. There's very few things that are not attributed to something else. And if you look at the head of a .223 cartridge, you can compare it directly to a 9mm Luger cartridge case, and the similarities are very, very, very close. The exact measurements are somewhat different, but you actually can use the same shell holder when you're reloading them. So I'm sure Mike Walker stole a little bit of the engineering capacity that was at the Remington factory at the time with regard to cup and draw of the brass. But Stoner's first foray into meeting the military's standards for performance was that he took the .222 Remington and used it in the AR-15 platform, and in testing he found that it simply didn't have enough poop to do what the military demanded. Well, he just simply did what any good engineer would do. He simply took the .222 case, he went to the shop and made a reamer that would ream out a little bit more chamber, blew out the cases, and he was, voila, he had now. Naturally, the cases you'll find are a little bit longer with a .223 now, but he was able to basically make some usable .223 cases. They were a little bit shorter than what we finally settled on, but he was able to up the ante a little bit with a little bit more powder, and he was able to drive a 55 grain boat tail bullet at the speeds necessary to do what the military wanted, which was to punch both sides of a steel pot at 500 yards. And they were still talking in terms of yards in those days. We hadn't yet gotten completely into the meters, the metric thing. So that was how that evolved. The the original design he had was a 14-inch 1 in 14 twist. The 1 in 14 twist was found to be inadequate under certain conditions. In cold testing, it was found that it didn't sufficiently stabilize the 55 grain long boat tail bullet. So the twist was quickened to 1 in 12, and as you know, the twist has been since quickened much more, down to the point where now it's a 1 in 7 twist, and that's to also allow the use of bullets which have lighter density, such as steel core armor penetrating bullets, which have to by necessity to be 55 grains or 62 grains or whatever it is they have to be. Whenever you start packing something other than lead inside, they become less dense and they have to become longer for the same diameter bore. So we've settled finally on 1 in 7 twist, but for so many years, and I carried a gun which was a 1 in 12 twist also, and in that rifle it was certainly pretty accurate. How accurate were those rifles? Well, in testing those rifles in those days, with the ammunition that was supplied for the purpose of testing, they found that they averaged around 3.5 to 4 inch groups at 100 yards. You might think that that's pretty lousy. Well, consider that that was as good. Those are issue grade rifles. That was as good from an issue grade rifle as match grade Garands and M14s were of the day with military ammo. So, you know, that was quite an accomplishment without having to do anything special to them. Just pulling, I think in one test they pulled 40 guns at random off the line and just subjected them to testing, and that's what they got. So they got basically match grade, what they considered to be match grade accuracy out of those guns. And during one of the tests, which as a matter of fact, Gun Digest was involved with, John T. Amber was involved with a test which involved the individuals from Armalite. And I've mentioned this particular issue that I had. This developed my interest really in a lot of things to do with the 223 and the 222, as a matter of fact. The 1965 Gun Digest got a fabulous history of the early development of the M16, and that's only 2 years after reports had come back from Vietnam by the Air Force, and it's also quite a bit before it was actually became a full-scale issue to Army and Marine troops. So there's a thumbnail history of how the cartridge and the rifle developed. But I probably should talk in the next episode about how. I'll leave it go at this point, but I want to talk about how it became suddenly a rifle under its own assault. It was a bitterly embattled rifle. It was a concept rifle that many people didn't accept from the very get-go, as I mentioned with the ordnance people, and it had a lot of snares set up for it to make it fail. So I'll talk about that and how much of the dispute came about, and I also want to talk about some of the myths associated with the M16, the 223 cartridge, and the 5.56 NATO. So in my next video, we'll address those things. But for now, I bid you adieu. God bless.